Okay, what do you think about the Japanese when they first invaded our country?
I cannot really say anything good about the Japanese. Their army was very cruel. They took a lot of prisoners and put them into prison. They tortured a lot of the people of Malaya at that time and Singapore, whom they suspected of being the enemy. And then schools were no more functioning, and the Japanese made the people to learn the Japanese language. The school children had to learn the Japanese language, and then the Japanese army went around catching a lot of people whom they suspected of being the enemy, and the aeroplanes bombed a lot of places in Malaya. I still remember they bombed in Kota Baru, in Singapore, and many other places in Malaya.
So what is the food?
Food,
That time?
food, people were struggling to find food, and most of them had to grow tapioca to feed themselves and to feed the children. And it was really a very, very cruel of the Japanese. They could not be bothered if people ate or did not eat. What they did was they tortured a lot of people whom they suspected of being with them on the side of the British, and they took a lot of prisoners, both Malays, Chinese, and English.
How old were you when Japanese invaded our country?
When the Japanese invaded Malaya and Singapore, I was very small. I think I was only 6 years old. But the facts that I give you in this interview are from the newspaper cuttings and the books that I have read.
Alright. How was the punishment if the people disobey the Japanese?
The punishment by the Japanese was very severe. They would tie them up and put them in locked places and did not give them any food to eat. Whether they died or lived, they could not be bothered. That was the Japanese way of teaching the Malaysians to obey them. And a lot of other things, especially the torture by the Japanese army.
Would they kill them?
They what? Do they?
Is there many people got killed because of the punishment?
A lot of people got killed, got murdered, and those people who spoke anything bad about the Japanese were taken away and put behind locked doors. And a lot of the families were broken up, the children taken away from the parents taken away from the children. All these kind of things the Japanese did. They went around taking a lot of people in prison and put them into prison camps. The camps, if you had the chance to see the movies, were really very cruel things that you could not imagine were happening by the Japanese army.
Okay. I understand there were many Malaysians died when working with Japanese for the railway line.
Yes, a lot of people died while working for the Japanese on the railway line from Malaya to Thailand. And there was also a movie made, I've forgotten the name of the movie, where a lot of people died. Malaysians who could not work on the railway lines because of mosquitoes and because no places to sleep and all that. They died of lack of food, lack of sleep, and lack of a lot of other things. And that is one story where a lot of Malaysians and other nationalities died while working on the rail lines.
Why did the Japanese surrender to the British?
Not only to the British, the Japanese were made to surrender to the British, the New Zealand forces, and the Australian forces, and many other allied forces. And but before they surrendered, a lot of places were bombed by the British Air Force, the Australian Air Force, and then the Japanese had no other choice but to surrender. And if I'm not mistaken about the date, the Japanese surrendered. They surrendered to the British way back in 1944 or 1945, and then Malaya was freed from Japanese rule, and Singapore also was freed from the Japanese, and the Japanese had to surrender to the British. That is a short story of what the Japanese did and how they treated the people when they were in Malaya and in Singapore.